Throughout history, a variety of phenomena have led to the great displacement and mobilization of human beings. Plagues, swarms of locusts, or ideologies, or religion, politics, economics, the discovery of gold and other precious metals, even climate change, when there's a drought or a blizzard, people have moved. But consistently throughout history, the greatest mobilizer of people has been war. It's in times of war that the greatest amount of people are united in mobilization behind a cause, and obviously, because it's a war, in opposition to that cause. And then, of course, there are the multitudes that are caught in the path of this advancing ideology, this advancing mobilization, and are thus forcibly mobilized as well. And that is pretty consistent. For the past 15,000 years, depending on which scientist you believe, for the past 15,000 years that humans have been in organized, semi-urbanized or greater urbanized communities, the greatest mobilizer has been war. And now, you and I live the change. For the first time in 15,000 years, for the first time in organized, advanced societies of human beings, the greatest mobilizer of people happens in peacetime. And this is as a consequence of a so-called pandemic. I'm calling it a so-called pandemic because some people call it so and others don't, and I wish to exclude nobody. It does not reflect at all on my personal judgment on the veracity or the vehemence of the so-called pandemic. Here in South Africa, we are now in day 2 of a nationwide lockdown, and I think at this stage it's important that we reflect a bit and see what the consequences of this mass mobilization of people behind a single idea has been. A mobilization that already eclipses the size and span of the Second World War, and I dare say the economic consequences as well, because as you know, the economic ramifications of the so-called pandemic is worldwide and it's massive. Of course, we may recover and then perhaps we might not recover. I think it'll be more a case of some will recover and others closer to home certainly won't. Let's reflect on the consequences on our immediate lives. I would like to at this stage point out that the fight for freedom is as old as human civilization. For the past 15,000 years we've been fighting for rights, for the citizenry and for the individuals. And alas, some of these rights have been earned so long ago that we've come to take them for granted. We had forgotten about the blood, sweat and tears that were spent acquiring them, and now we've come to take them for granted. And it is in these extraordinary times that we discover how quickly they can be taken away, things that we've taken for granted. Let's start with democracy. You realize, of course, that at the moment South Africa is not a democratic state and we have no access to the normal machinery of democracy. We certainly cannot vote. We cannot organize political rallies. There may not be speeches. We may not engage in public protest. So for all intents and purposes, there is a moratorium on democracy, and for at least the next 20 days, because we're in day 2 of the 21-day stretch, there is absolutely no democracy to be had in South Africa. Also, the restriction of people's movement. You may not move where you want to, when you want to. There are limits to your personal freedom of movement. We've been warned that we should stay at home, and we've already seen footage of heavy-handed police action against people who do not stay at home. The black folks of South Africa will remember the time of the pass. They'll remember what it's like to not be able to move freely without a little paper. I myself do have a paper. I got a paper because I need a permit as a farmer. I need to be able to move around and to do my farming thing. We've been deemed essential services. I don't enjoy that at all. Speaking of essential services, we are also now being told by the government which are essential goods and which are not essential goods. We're being told, for example, that cigarettes and booze are not essential, and therefore we have no access to them for the next 21 days, even though we are allowed to go to the shop, the same shop that sells them as the one that sells those goods that are deemed essential, such as, for instance, bread. And what's interesting about this is that such a broad judgment and execution of that judgment by the government has an exceptional impact on the lives of various individuals. I am a good example. I'm allergic to wheat, which means I cannot eat bread, which is deemed an essential good. But I can smoke and I can drink, but I may not. So bread, which is of no use to me, is deemed more essential to me than cigarettes and booze, which I deem to be of good use to me. And one has to consider that. I see many people are praising this move and are reveling in the discomfort of those who want a fag and a dope. But you realize that a day or two or a week or a year, somewhere in the future, that very rule, the precedent that has been set by it, may turn on you. Maybe you're a vegan and it's decided that your special vegan requirements are no longer deemed essential services. You have to eat like the others do. It is that way with all precedents and with all exceptions made on the particular rights of certain individuals, that somewhere in the future those who had celebrated the passing of those rules and the legislation that limit those people eventually run into difficulty themselves. So cheer not too soon. It's always good to defend the rights of all people, because in doing so you know that your own rights are defended for posterity. Speaking of posterity, obviously we live in a time of precedents that are being set, and we know that in law judges are very careful of that. Whenever a judge presides over a case where it seems like there might be some precedent set, the judge has to act with great wisdom and with a great vision of the future, because he knows that for all posterity, the precedent that he sets here may be used and referenced in order to affect the outcome of cases in the future with regards to the traditional interpretation of the law. So we have a precedent of a moratorium on democracy. We have a precedent of the restriction of people's movement, kind of stuff that we saw last in the previous regime during the era of apartheid. We have a precedent of the government deeming what is essential to you and what is not essential to you. We have the precedent, for the first time, at least in the current dispensation, which is now about 25 years old, of censorship, where freedom of speech, regardless of whether it is guaranteed by the Constitution or not, suddenly there are limits to the freedom of speech. You may not criticize the government's approach to this handling of the so-called pandemic, and you also may not propagate the notion that you do not believe in the veracity of the claims as to the so-called pandemic's virulence. So we have censorship, and all these wonderful precedents are things that might, let me rephrase that, will come back to haunt us somewhere in the future. I've been very disappointed by many people on social media, notable South African celebrities or voices of the people or voices of what seemed to be reason in the past, who have all turned in the recent days. Suddenly you have people who have identified strongly with the libertarian ideology and with the idea, the notion of personal individual freedom, who are now cowering in fear and supporting the state in its draconian measures. Brave internet warriors who worked their fingers to little stumps, typing out their opposition to any infringement of their personal rights. And now they are haunted by fear. And not only do they demand authority, they also demand that this authority is imposed upon others who do not agree with it. And sometimes they assume this authority for themselves and use it to speak out against other people, while at the same time degenerating into an Orwellian paradigm where they can split on other people and report them to the authorities and film them. Big Brother is your own brother, it would seem. Big Brother is your neighbor. We don't need to employ state apparatchiks to impose the will of Big Brother anymore. We can now simply rely on your neighbor or the guy who sees you in the street. And then the outrage on mass media. What a wonderful machine. What a terrible machine, what a cruel machine, and what an extremely dangerous machine society has become. So for those internet warriors for whom libertarianism and the upholding and the defense of personal individual freedoms and rights were but a veneer, I see you. And for all posterity, the precedent has been set for me to never be able to trust you again. And when I do see you in the streets, I'll give you another mouthful. And as you can gauge by this presentation, I am capable of a mouthful. And I have many more words reserved for those brave internet hero cowards. Right, let's look to the future. We have 20 more days left of this, 19 more days, because today is almost over. Where is it going to go? Well, maybe it's time for a little humorous intermission. Let's start with the president of this, the president of this country, who, of course, is not fit for office. And let me qualify that. I don't deem anybody, I've never met a man or a woman or a child or an animal fit to govern me. And as such, anybody who assumes public office, of which the purpose is, of course, to govern me, is deemed by myself to be unfit for office. So that's as far as I'm concerned. If you're in agreement, nod. And if you're not, I don't see you. I don't care. But our president certainly is, in my opinion, and as far as I'm concerned, not fit to govern. And he's been very good at disappearing in times of crisis. And if he is found, he always acts with surprise and says, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know that this was the case." So he's obviously, by his own admission, ignorant of the street level sensibilities of your average South African, and is also mostly disappearing. And isn't it extremely ironic that he's been at his most visible in camouflage? So the president dresses in camouflage and at once he appears. And now we can see him. But a few days before he appeared in camouflage, he appeared on a nationwide broadcast, which of course I didn't see because I do have better things to do with my time. But what I have noticed is the extent to which people praised him for that. And what was remarkable was that those who praised him for the speech were mostly those who very likely did not vote for him. There were also those who are most likely to vote for a decent leader, except there's not enough of them. And thirdly, they're most likely to follow the rule of law, albeit draconian as it is implemented in the country at present. On the other hand, you have the electorate who put this buffoon in power. And that electorate evidently is not adept at electing a decent leader in the first place. Secondly, evidently, as I've seen today, not willing to follow the rule of law. And thirdly, from them I haven't heard a great deal of praise for his wonderful leadership speech. Isn't it ironic? But yes, let's fast forward to the next, to what will happen in 20 days' time from now. Do you think for one moment that everything will change, that everything will go back to normal, for as much as the word normal may be ventured in the direction of a country like South Africa? Do you think things will go back to normal? Do you understand what's happening to the economy at the moment? I know all my colleagues in the entertainment industry are unable to perform, and most of them rely on live performances for their money, and most of my friends in any event, live on the edge. They scrape by every month, and they have some problems coming their way, and those problems will become the problems of landlords. Yesterday I spoke to two very successful businessmen. One has an aluminum factory. He employs 22 people, and he told me that for him it's a matter of deciding whether or not now is a good time to be bankrupt. Maybe it's you should declare yourself insolvent before you spend more money and eventually face the inevitability of your predicament. Obviously, these businessmen are holding out for the government to come with some sort of rescue package. We see that the Ruperts and the Matsepes and the Oppenheimers of this world have each given 1 billion rand. Well, 3 billion rand. Divide that by 50 million South Africans and you each get 60 rand. And you can't even buy booze and cigarettes with that 60 rand. My goodness. I don't know if this government... No, I lie. It's not that I don't know. I know for certain that this government is incapable of rescuing this situation because they don't have the resources. They hardly have the resources to prop up those failing state-owned enterprises. But here's what might happen. Firstly, the government really benefits from this so-called pandemic. Firstly, because of its very strong action, that which is deemed by some to be a great feat of leadership. Because if in a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year from now, we see that not many lives were lost in this pandemic, we will certainly look back, some will look back and say, you see, it's because of the strong action of the government and the great leadership that was shown that lives were saved. Can you imagine what it would have been like if, in fact, a great many people die as a consequence? Then that same government and its apparatchiks, its proponents and its supporters and its newfound fans will say, well, can you imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have these measures put in place? It would have been an absolutely worse disaster than it already is. So it's a win-win situation for the government. It's also a win-win situation for the government because it has managed to set some precedents. There is a state of emergency for all intents and purposes, which has changed many freedoms, altered the right to many freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution. But here's the doozy. 20 days from now, we will be in an even worse economic position than we are now, aided by the obstreperous Moody's, who for years has refused to downgrade us to junk status, but eventually could not ignore the signs anymore, and then put its word and its judgment in the same box as Fitch and Standard and Poor, and decided, well, this country indeed is not creditworthy, and we have now been downgraded to junk status, as most of you know, yesterday. And once we come out of this, 20 days from now, we will see that there's been a massive capital outflow because whomever from abroad was invested in this country will, in the current climate, decide to put their money somewhere safer. In any event, they haven't received any encouraging words from our hiding president, who has now come out in camouflage to be seen by all, that have incentivized further investment in this country, contrary to his protestations and his claims. People have not been earning money, will not have been earning money for a couple of weeks. And now what are they to do? My friend with the aluminum business, who's going to buy his products? Because nobody needs, well, at least can afford his products, because they themselves haven't earned to be able to spend money on his products. Then there is the other friend that I didn't mention just now, the one who is in transport. And his workers are willing to work, but they get to the depots and those workers are not willing to work because they saw that they are allowed to not go to work. And so his trucks are standing there, he has to pay his workers, and he can't get more loads. He's losing hours because the trucks are standing there and no one can offload it, no one can sign it, no one can receive it. So that is a serious problem for him. What's he going to do? What's he going to do with all the debt? What's he going to do with all the goods? And I'm telling you now, the government is incapable of rescuing these businesses. And $60 a person from the billionaires of the country will also not do. So, here's one way out. Again, the government wins because we have these precedents that have been set, and we also know that we have this dire predicament in the country, and now that serves as the ideal vehicle for the government to pass certain ideas that they've been testing on the public discourse and on international trade and investment confidence. Things like expropriation without compensation. What if the government says in a couple of weeks' time, well, the people need food, so every farmer is obliged to immediately let go of 10% of their produce, if not the means for that produce, in order to serve the nation so that these people may be fed. Then there is that wonderful institution called the pension fund here in South Africa. Wow, what a wonderful treasure trove that is. And for a long time the government has been trying to get hold of it, but they've been blocked at every opportunity. But now things are looking different. We need to save the country. So the pension fund, which is the last great in the sea of half sinking ships that is South Africa, there is this one shining armada, and that is the pension fund. And finally the government can get their hands on that odd trillion or more than a trillion rands that sits there and waits, and they can use it. And obviously they'll use it to fill their pockets, as they've done. I'm only using the history as a reference. Fill their pockets first, and then the pockets of the banks, which is also just a reference from history, so I have no reason to believe that the next time it'll be different. And then of course they'll prop up all those failing state-owned enterprises. And the problem with that is that you cannot rescue those state-owned enterprises with all the money in the world, because you're only treating the symptom and not the disease. The disease is a lack of competence. The disease is a lack of ambition, because it's always guaranteed a bailout. The disease is poor management. So it'll only be a matter of time before they need money again, except then there will be no pension fund to plunder to that extent. And then you can't pay the pensioners, and then you can't put out all these SASSA grants. And then what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have a revolution on your hands. So what do we do in a revolution? Well, at least within the next 20 days, we're going to have a very good reference as to what can be done, and I'll tell you why. At the moment, we have the military and the police in different areas in the country, not restraining and controlling people, but doing their damnedest to do it, and making utter fools of themselves in the presses. Heavy-handed approach that shows the lack of discipline and shows the lack of competence and the lack of understanding to the gravity of the matter and the sort of responsibility that it requires from their positions. So we'll see if they can contain the masses. So far, so bad. And for every other South African who might be looking forward to a state of revolution or semi-revolution, this is going to be very revealing, because we are now seeing the capability of the state to maintain law and order, even though it is a law of dubious, what's the word, a law of dubious, oh my goodness, English goodness. Anyway, we'll know how they can deal with it, and then somewhere in the future that will be a very handy reference that will guide the actions of citizens in the protection of their property and in their approach to the government. So it's all extremely dire, but then again, South Africa has always been good at not being great, and has always been good at only just avoiding absolute catastrophe. It was 120 years ago that this country was in a war against the mightiest empire in the world, and that didn't go too badly. We had them on their knees there for a while until they beat us, and then we just took a while and then we beat them back. So, yes, you have been notified.